it rolling, Bob?
Is it rolling, Bob?
Is it rolling, Bob?
Hi folks, and this is a head full of ideas, season 3, episode 6, and this one's called Nonsense Songs from the Basement Tapes, part 1. The Basement Tapes are quite an amazing collection of songs recorded in a basement of a house in upstate New York, rather near the famous Woodstock, in 1967. While the rest of the world was going psychedelic, Bob Dylan and the band were sitting in their basement doing stuff that was really perhaps even weirder than the acid heads out there were doing. Anyway, Nonsense Songs from the Basement Tapes, part 1. We start off with a few quotes. Alice, if I had a world of my own, everything would be nonsense. Nothing would be what it is, because everything would be what it isn't. And contrariwise, what it is, it wouldn't be. And what it wouldn't be, it would. You make sense of that? That's from Alice in Adventures in Wonderland, and of course by Lewis Carroll. I am he as you are he, and you are me, and we are all together. John Lennon, I Am the Walrus. Talking nonsense is the sole privilege mankind possesses over the other organisms. It's by talking nonsense that one gets to the truth. I talk nonsense, therefore I'm human. That's Fyodor Dostoevsky in Notes from the Underground. 1967 was arguably the most dramatic year of cultural change in the 20th century. The newspapers were bursting with salacious reports of love-ins and happenings. Young people were appearing in public in outlandish clothes. Men were growing their hair long, and women were abandoning the coiffured look of old. In California, thousands of those who the press had labelled hippies were taking to the streets, and sometimes living on the streets. All over the US, protests were erupting against the Vietnam War. Although those who took part in LSD-inspired psychedelic revolutions were always in a minority, a cultural shift was certainly taking place. The alternative society, or counterculture, which first emerged into public view in this epochal year, was to have many offshoots, spawning ecological consciousness, feminism, gay rights protests, and many other forms of social activism, which were to become increasingly influential as the century wore on. Popular music, in particular the genre that was becoming increasingly referred to as rock music rather than rock and roll, was at the forefront of change. The Beatles, easily the world's most popular group, still the world's most popular group, aren't they, led the charge with singles and albums that used poetic lyrics and sonic trickery to duplicate the psychedelic experience. There's songs like Strawberry Fields Forever, A Day in the Life, All You Need Is Love. The Monterey Pop Festival in June of that year featured almost all of the leading countercultural American bands, and is remembered most today for Jimi Hendrix's climatic performance of Wild Thing, after which he ritually sets his guitar on fire. Revolution, it seemed, was very much in the air, along with many new and exotic smells, tastes, and images. Strangely, though, as far as the world knew, Bob Dylan was merely absent through all this. He'd been promoted by members of the counterculture as not only their leading intellectual, but also, and even more scary for Dylan himself perhaps, a kind of prophet. Many years later, in his amazing memoir, Chronicles Volume 1, Dylan would express horror at this term being used to describe him. Yet to many young people it seemed that the prophecy of a song like The Times They Are A-Changing had indeed come true. Those sons and daughters really had broken away from the commands of their elders. All Dylan would need to do, it seemed, was to make some kind of public appearances to be acclaimed as the leader of the movement. But this was the last thing he wanted to do. The years 1963 to 66 had seen him release 6 albums, write hundreds of songs, and rise to become a household name on both sides of the Atlantic and in other parts of the world too. This period had culminated in the notorious tour of the US, Britain and Australia, in which he'd been subjected to nightly abuse from outraged folk purists. More tours were planned, but after his motorcycle accident in 1966, he stepped away from the limelight. For the next few years, he would remain holed up in Woodstock in upstate New York, spending time with his young and rapidly growing family and with members of his backing group, still at that time known as the Hawks. The music they made together in 1967, recorded by keyboard player Garth Hudson on a reel-to-reel tape recorder, and which came to be known as the Basement Tapes, remained unreleased for several years. In the Basement Tapes, Bob Dylan mines a number of popular American musical forms, while taking his exploration of the limits of language to a new level. His trilogy of 65 to 66 albums had included long songs full of cryptic and sometimes hallucinatory imagery, such as Visions of Johanna, Desolation Row, and Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands, which had undoubtedly been an influence on the burgeoning psychedelic music scene. But after his motorcycle accident and his retreat from touring schedules, Dylan began producing shorter, more compressed lyrics featuring lyrical and musical motifs derived from the blues, country, gospel, and the various styles of American music that he had thoroughly grounded himself in before becoming a songwriter. One particular group of lyrics from the Basement Tapes has often confounded critics and reviewers, many of whom have concluded that the songs are merely nonsensical pieces and that attempting to interpret them is therefore largely futile. Dylan, as we are told, is merely having fun with his compadres from the band, turning out material that they would never expect the wider public to hear, and thus paying little attention to coherence at the expense of spontaneity. Whatever the appeal of the songs, it's alleged, or has been alleged by some people, that he's merely spouting meaningless gibberish for comic effect. It can be argued, however, that such judgments underestimate both Dylan's engagement with modernist literature and his willingness to experiment with a variety of lyrical forms. These are certainly funny songs with plenty of bawdy and drunken ironic humour, in apparent celebration of various forms of debauchery, characterised by apparently absurd or even surreal juxtapositions and set in a mythical American landscape in an uncertain but apparently somewhat archaic time period full of dubious and corrupt characters. The songs, at least at first listen, appear to use language randomly, even to the extent of using invented words. Sense and nonsense appear to be interchangeable. Specific lyrics are often changed in subsequent live recordings of the songs or in Dylan's edits in the official lyric books. That's quite an interesting point, really. If you read the official lyric books, you'll see Dylan doing all kinds of often very odd edits that don't always actually improve the songs at all. It's just another one of those little tricks he throws out to put us off balance, I think. Dylan appears to delight in creating characters here, usually only mentioned once in passing with distinctively funny names. The songs are delivered by him in a deep and lugubrious tone, very different to the kind of style of singing he'd been doing in most recent albums, which is made even more parodic by the deft harmonies supplied by Richard Manuel and Rick Danko. It's two of the great singers in the band. It's also perhaps worth mentioning that Lee Von Helm was not in the band at the time, although he did rejoin them towards the end of this period. The fact that the tapes were made outside of the conventional setup of modern recording studios, using rather basic reel-to-reel tape recorders, and that therefore not all the lyrics are actually intelligible, only adds to the air of mystery and apparent randomness that distinguishes these recordings. In 1967, Dylan had recently become a father, and no doubt having been called upon to sing lullabies to his kids, may well be, even if subconsciously, penning material that's reminiscent of nursery rhymes. Well, I guess you can't really sing the times they are changing to your kids. Might be dangerous, mightn't it? They might get out of control. So anyway, many years later, after his second marriage, he would devote most of the nursery rhyme type songs on Under the Red Sky album to his latest child. Many nursery rhymes, which of course can be considered to be authentic songs in the folk tradition, do have a dark side. For instance, Ring a Ring a Roses is said to have originated during the Black Death, as all the children fall down. In these basement songs, Dylan is clearly in this kind of territory. Many of them have a dark and mysterious logic which hints at hidden terrors that children are often afraid of. At the time of the recording of the Basement tapes in 1967, Dylan was under some pressure from his management to produce new material. During the recording of the tapes, a 14-song acetate was circulated to various rock musicians and groups with a view to them recording the songs. This may be one reason as to why the material, despite the supposedly impenetrable lyrics, uses more conventional musical structures than Dylan's previous work, as well as a number of distinctive sing-along choruses. Again, Dylan's demonstrating that he can actually operate in many different musical fields here. Several covers, including Manfred Mann's version of the Mighty Quinn and the Byrds' reading of You Ain't Going Nowhere, became hits for other artists. Dylan's deliberate engagement with a pop sensibility in the chorus stands in ironic contrast to the gnomic utterances of the verses. The songs are certainly funny, but their light-heartedness is often counterposed by the far darker suggestiveness of their arcane imagery. The first song to be recorded in the basement of the Big Pink, which displays these characteristics, is the bizarre Tiny Montgomery. The song doesn't have a chorus as such, but Dylan's vocals are backed by high-pitched harmonies by Manuel, Helm and Robbie Robertson, which act as a counter-melody to the main tune. This is highly rhythmic and infectious and is driven mainly by Dylan's acoustic guitar. The song thus has a kind of unsung chorus, and each verse ends in a refrain indicating that the character will soon be coming to say hello. Dylan affects a deeper vocal timbre than usual, which contrasts against the backing vocals to create a mood of considerable uncertainty. This is highly appropriate because we cannot be certain as to what kind of character Tiny Montgomery actually is. The song maintains an ambiguous balance between light-hearted banter and a potentially threatening tone. A nickname like Tiny is often given ironically to persons who are extremely tall, a technique known as antiphrasis. There you are, you learn something every day, don't you? One example was the 6'1" performer Tiny Tim, famous in the late 1960s for novelty hits like Tiptoe Through the Tulips. Sorry, that was my Tiny Tim impression. Tiptoe Through the Tulips and other show tunes from the pre-war era delivered in his distinctive falsetto. Tim had been actually a friend of Dylan in his Greenwich Village days and visited Woodstock in 1967 during the recording of the Basement tapes. He actually recorded a number of songs with the band as backing musicians. The name also conjures up an image of a circus strongman. That's the name Tiny Montgomery. The use of such a nickname at once infantilises the character, but also has a vaguely threatening nature. It's clear from the song that Mr. Montgomery is not a character to be messed with. Each of the 5 verses describes how the inhabitants of Old Frisco will prepare for Tiny's arrival, before we are again told that he'll be arriving soon. The strident guitar rhythm leads straight into Dylan proclaiming, "Well, you can tell everybody down in Old Frisco, tell him Tiny Montgomery says hello." The reference to Old Frisco immediately suggests that we are in some past time, perhaps in the post-gold rush 19th century, when San Francisco became a notorious haunt of criminal gangs. The invocation is immediately arresting. Tiny is then referred to as the bringer of sensual delights. Every boy and girl gonna get their bang, Dylan draws, because Tiny Montgomery's gonna shake that thing. You have to say bang and fang in order to make that rhyme, don't you? Already the song is infused with sexually suggestive detail. Bang, of course, being a common euphemism for sex, while shake that thing is a frequently used phrase in the blues relating to sexual displays, as in two different songs with that title recorded by Lightning Hopkins and Wynonie Harris. Several other dubious sounding characters, including the rather wonderfully named Skinny Moo and T-Bone Frank, who we are told are going to get on down to the Fountain Bank, whatever a fountain bank is, I don't know. Is anybody in the fountain bank out there? I looked that one up and I couldn't really find it. But anyway, they're presumably going to the fountain bank, presumably to draw their money in preparation for Tiny's visit. The official lyrics change this to, they're both going to be getting out of the tank, which perhaps makes more sense, as the tank presumably refers to the prison that these characters will be exiting, or perhaps escaping from. The next lines, one bird book and a buzzard and a crow, again have sexual connotations. A buzzard is a man who takes advantage of drunken women. A crow is a derogatory word for a supposedly ugly woman, and a bird book may contain a man's list of potential dates. The remaining verses take us into ever more obscure and euphemistic territory. The fourth verse contains some advice regarding Tiny's arrival. Scratch your dad, do that thing, suck that pig, and bring it on home. All of which sounds like rather obscure sexual innuendo. Bring It On Home is a sexual invitation in a number of blues songs, including one with this actual title by Willie Dixon, which was first recorded by Sonny Boy Williamson. Here, Dylan stretches the blues convention of creative sexual innuendo to its limits, inferring that the song is, to some extent, a blues parody. Pick that drain and nose that dough. Pick that drain and nose that dough. He really does sing that. Seems to refer to the act of snorting cocaine, which the narrator seems to be suggesting will be more preparation for Tiny's arrival. The next verse tells us more about Tiny himself. We are told that he is king of the drunks, and rather memorably that he squeezes too, whatever that means. Advice is given to two more characters. Watch out, Lester. Take it, Lou. We are told to join the monks, the CIO. This advice seems to be more for those who wish to avoid the effects of Tiny's arrival. The initial CIO appear to refer to the Congress of Industrial Organizations, actually a highly respectable union organization in the USA. Perhaps joining this organization, or perhaps a monastery, will help avoid what will be the devastating effects of the coming of Tiny Montgomery. In the final verse, which at 16 lines is twice as long as the others, we return to more preparatory advice. Now Dylan really lets go, indulging himself in a stream of apparently delirious nonsense. Grease that gig and play it plain, tell them to go out and gas that dog, trick on in and flour that snow, take it all in and begin to grow. Now play it low and pick it up, take it all in a ball cup. Well, it may be nonsense, but it's pretty good nonsense, isn't it? There appear to be further arcane drug references here, and the concluding reference to a three-legged man and a hot-lipped hoe appear to be more sexual innuendo. Tiny Montgomery is a delicious slice of parody, which delights in its own obscurity, mixing well-established euphemisms for sex and drugs with more shadowy references. It's possible to read the story behind the song in a number of different ways. Dylan might be sending a strangely coded message to the hippies, who are now gathering headlines by appearing on the streets of San Francisco in this, the Summer of Love. Perhaps he is sending them a warning about their indulgence in drugs and free love. The song actually tells us nothing about Montgomery himself, except for his name. Dylan clearly has his tongue very firmly in his cheek here. Tiny Montgomery is a very funny song, made more so by the mock doo-wop vocalisations that contribute so much to its effect. Or perhaps Tiny is some kind of superhero who will come to old Frisco and knock out the pimps and drug dealers. The song is a riotously self-conscious parody of the kind of euphemistic language, especially referring to matters of sex and drugs, that tends to be espoused by members of what was becoming known as the underground. At the same time, it can be seen as a nonsense song for kids. Much of the reason for Dylan's retreat from the mainstream music scene in 1966-7 was motivated by his attempt to distance himself from the way that many of the hippies held him up not only as a great songwriter, but as a kind of potential leader of their movement. Bob Dylan for president, a famous badge proclaimed, perhaps only half jokingly, that Dylan could actually be the leader of the country. Dylan himself, as he reveals in his semi-autobiographical work Chronicles, hated this kind of attention. There's little doubt that the nonsense songs on the Basement tapes reflect this attitude, even in coded form. The way in which the presumably rather corrupt inhabitants of Old Frisco prepare for the coming of Tiny Montgomery, as if he is some kind of messiah, may suggest that Tiny's reputation is way out of proportion to his actual importance. So, in a way, Tiny Montgomery is a kind of parodic version of Dylan himself, or a picture of the expectations that people have of him. Another song which takes up this theme more prominently is the much more famous The Mighty Quinn, otherwise known as Quinn the Eskimo, of which there are two takes on the Basement tapes. The British beat group Manfred Mann had a #1 signal in the UK with their extremely bright, optimistic and poppy version of the song. Singer Mike Darbo claimed to have no idea what the verses were about, but the song is made unforgettable by its extremely catchy chorus. Come all without, come all within, you'll not see nothing but the Mighty Quinn. This actually became a very popular chant on English football grounds for several years, especially for supporters of teams containing a player with the surname Quinn. The alliterative second half of the chorus is another one of Dylan's distinctive double negatives, while the first part appears to be an almost religious kind of rallying cry. While Tiny Montgomery is a rather flawed messiah figure, Quinn the Eskimo's anticipated arrival will be treated with great reverence. The title of the song was supposedly a reference to the 1960 film The Savage Innocents, which featured the Mexican-American actor Anthony Quinn playing the part of Inuk, an Eskimo. And Anthony Quinn was cast as any kind of foreign person in Hollywood films in those days. Although the character in the song has nothing in common with the part Quinn plays in the movie. The song's been covered by many different artists, including the Grateful Dead. Dylan himself has only performed it, however, on a handful of occasions. On the two versions on the Basement tapes, Dylan adopts a deep, gravelly vocal tone, far removed from the hit single's bouncy surface. Although The Mighty Quinn is in many ways another light-hearted children's song, the way it is performed here makes it sound decidedly spooky. This emphasises the comic irony of the piece, as Dylan's rather nervous-sounding narrator delivers another song characterised by highly ambiguous nonsense lyrics set against a sing-along chorus, which Dylan deliberately plays down. The narrator sounds distinctly worried about the imminent arrival of the much-revered Eskimo, despite the man's apparent status as some kind of saviour. In the first of the song's three verses, the apparently joyful, optimistic nonsense lyrics come over as dryly ironic. Everybody's building the big ships and boats. Some are building monuments. Others are jotting down notes. Dylan sings slyly from the side of his mouth as he describes the general excitement at the imminent arrival of another messiah-like figure. As in Tiny Montgomery, there's an intimation of the involvement of children in the narrative. Everybody's in despair, every girl and boy, with Quinn being presented almost as a Santa Claus figure. But when Quinn the Eskimo gets here, everybody's going to jump for joy. But Dylan's deadpan delivery makes these lines sound darkly ominous, an effect which is increased by Garth Hudson's churchy organ. In the succeeding verses, Dylan adopts the voice of a first-person narrator, who begins with a kind of personal declaration. The self-effacing statement, "I like to do just like the rest. I like my sugar sweet." In the first of the two Basement Tapes versions, he cackles memorably, "I likes to do," as if he is some cynical old-timer watching the whole shebang from the sidewalk, perhaps spitting in the gutter as the parade goes by. The delicious paradoxical ambiguity of the second line can be read as a childish statement, but also a coded reference to sex or drugs. The next lines feature some of Dylan's most memorable, absurdist nonsense images. "But guarding fumes and making haste, it ain't my cup of meat." Here, as elsewhere on the Basement Tapes, Dylan creates a comic effect by substituting an unexpected word for the obvious one. The expression he works around is the quintessentially British "my cup of tea," usually used to indicate that whatever's being referred to is not what the speaker actually likes. The rhyming of sweet and meat is particularly comically effective here, suggesting that whatever the supposedly beneficent Quinn will bring will be more substantial and potentially indigestible than his followers might expect. The narrator then observed a little caustically that everybody's need for trees, feeding pigeons on a limb, but when Quinn the Eskimo gets here, all the pigeons are going to run to him, suggesting that Quinn's followers are nothing more than dumb birds who are only interested in who is providing the most crumbs. The final verse is the most problematical in the song. It is here that Dylan ramps up the nonsense factor. The opening lines of the Basement Tape performances are virtually unintelligible. When the song is first performed live in a cheerfully rocked-out version at the Isle of Wight Festival in 1969, we get "a cat's meow and a cow's moo, I can recite 'em all," followed by the apparently random "just tell me where it hurts you, honey, I'll tell you who to call." This appears to be some kind of reference to the general malaise that the boys and girls are suffering from before Quinn will come to save them. Then, in a wonderfully comic final twist, Dylan tells us that nobody can get any sleep. There's someone on everybody's toes. A rather surreal or perhaps merely silly image, which is followed by the knowingly ironic, "but when Quinn the Eskimo gets here, everybody's going to want to doze." Our saviour will, it seems, be bringing the precious gift of repose to the citizens. In I'm Only Sleeping, from the Beatles' Revolver, released in the previous year, John Lennon had presented sleeping as a metaphor for stoned intoxication. Here the doze/dose double meaning is rather more obviously indicated. So, is the Mighty Quinn a drug dealer? Is this song, like Tiny Montgomery, a coded warning about the effects of various substances? This is certainly one of the main interpretations which have been placed on the song. As usual, however, Dylan delights in such ambiguity. Certainly, Quinn's arrival is highly anticipated, but the hollowness of his claims to be a saviour are challenged here. The pigeons, we are left in no doubt, will follow him alone. One could also see the song as mocking the way in which some religious people follow their leaders blindly, especially as the chorus is modelled on the kind of spirituals that gospel choirs perform regularly, with a rather surreal twist, of course. On another level, as with Tiny Montgomery and so many of the Basement songs, Mighty Quinn can be read as an ironic reference to Dylan's own career, given that his more excitable acid head followers had acclaimed him as some kind of messiah. The Mighty Quinn can also be seen as a parody of how the modern media creates false prophets. When Quinn finally arrives, all he really does is send his followers to sleep, or perhaps into a possibly drug-induced trance. Thus Quinn is a charlatan, a chimerical figure, not the Messiah, but perhaps something more threatening than a naughty little boy. So that's the end of part one of Nonsense Songs from the Basement Tapes. I'll be discussing a number of other supposedly nonsense songs in part two, which will be the next instalment of Bob Dylan, A Headful of Ideas. So don't forget to like and subscribe. Please send me some comments on YouTube or on my website. That would be great if we can get a bit of feedback going. And I'll see you next time. Bye.
Is it rolling, Bob?
Is it rolling, Bob?